So here's something about Tolkien's Legendarium that you might not have noticed before. Everything that we know about Middle-earth is told to us from the perspective of an in-universe narrator. The Hobbit, of course, is the recollections of Bilbo Baggins. The Lord of the Rings was primarily put together by Frodo. The Silmarillion is a collection of elven legends. Tolkien was a professor of medieval language, and he wanted to recreate this feeling of sifting through primary sources. But the thing that any scholar will know about primary sources is that you can't always take them at face value. In the original version of The Hobbit, Gollum gives the ring to Bilbo voluntarily, and Tolkien later retcons this by saying that Bilbo was just straight up lying in the first edition. And that has to make you wonder, what else might be a lie? The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion are set up as these epic tales of good versus evil, but from a certain lens, all of this looks a whole lot like propaganda. Is it possible that Mordor and Angband have their own side of the story that makes them seem a lot more sympathetic? Well, if you read Tolkien's letters, the answer is no, not at all. He wrote extensively about Middle-earth, and nowhere does he ever give any indication that we should take the struggle of good versus evil at anything other than face value. From his own philosophical standpoint, it's very important for him to portray Morgoth as this utterly bent creature of hatred and envy on a campaign of nihilistic rage against God the Creator, and Sauron as this petty tyrant intent on exerting total control over Middle-earth at the expense of the well-being of any of its inhabitants. And if you're a Tolkien purist, then that's the end of the matter. The professor has spoken, and his word is final. You can just close the video right now. But for the rest of us, well, the author is dead, both literally and metaphorically. In a work as popular and enduring as The Lord of the Rings, it's inevitable that new interpretations will rise up far beyond what the original author might have ever intended. Just think of all the retellings you've seen of the works of Shakespeare or Greek mythology. I think it's very fair to put Tolkien's Legendarium on the same level. The only thing that really sets it apart in any meaningful way is copyright law. The Tolkien estate will probably come and get you if you try to sell your bold retelling in bookstores. But if you have a simple passion project and you don't intend to make any money off of it, well, the lawyers usually won't touch your fanfiction. And there, the Tolkien Legendarium has built up a thriving community. Now, Sturgeon's Law definitely applies here, but if you're one of those people who dismisses fanfiction out of hand, then you're really missing out on a lot of interesting and insightful work. And I want to explore 3 particular works that completely revise the central conceit of the Tolkien Legendarium, and ask us whether we have our whole ideas of good and evil switched around the wrong way. Now, you might see this as something fascinating that could give us a new perspective on the entire Legendarium, or you might see it as a pointless, pretentious exercise in subversion for the sake of subversion. But you'll never really know for sure unless you come and take a closer look. So let's start out with The Last Ringbearer. So this is the one that has the most in the way of a pre-established reputation. The Lord of the Rings, retold by Kirill Yeskov, a Russian paleontologist. It is the story of Mordor as this advanced, enlightened civilization that is tragically invaded and destroyed by the backwards feudal kingdoms of the West. It was published in Russia in 1999. It was published as an actual book. The copyright laws there are a lot looser. And it got popular enough that it got several translations. But it's never been printed in English because the Tolkien estate would be all over that. However, in 2011, a guy named Israel Markov decided on his own time to translate it into English, and he got ESCOF's approval to publish it online for free. If he can't make any money off of it, you might as well put it out there for the people. And, well, it's a fairly juicy premise. Once it came out, there were a fair number of articles written about it, a lot of discussion threads. People just kind of love to bring up this book. Its mere existence is a tantalizing little fun fact. And in particular, what kind of primed my expectations going into it, I noticed that professional publications have this tendency to really gas it up. They talk about how it's a very complex book that handles lots of different themes, and they talk about this in a way that makes it come off as very mature and sophisticated. I get the sense that for a lot of these people, whenever they think about Russian literature, they think of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov and Nabokov. Those classics where, even if you don't personally get it, you still feel obligated to talk about it with a reverent tone. And that sense of obligation seems to carry over to any other book that comes out of Russia. But the fact of the matter is that not everything that a Russian person writes is crime and punishment. They have plenty of, less sophisticated books. Usually, those just don't get translated into English. We've got plenty of those of our own. And going into The Last Ringbearer, well, it's definitely very ambitious. It definitely has a lot of complicated ideas that it wants to cram into a book less than 300 pages long. But as for how well it sticks the landing, well. So if you open up the English edition of The Last Ringbearer, the first thing you'll notice is that it really doesn't read very well. The wording is very awkward and clunky, and includes a lot of casual language that feels very out of place for the context. A prime example of this would be how it recounts Aragorn's speech before the Battle of Pelennor Fields, which starts off as follows. We're all mortal, guys. What the hell does it matter if it's sooner or later? To me, it's way more interesting what's gonna happen to us afterwards. You probably think the General's nuts to talk about life after death right now, but I reckon, when's a better time? I mean, we're simple guys. Live in the field, pray to a shield. Once the danger's over, we give it no thought till the next time. Well guys, there's plenty of opinions about what's it gonna be. But one thing that everyone agrees on is that we're all gonna get whatever we believe in, and it just keeps going on like that. Now, to be fair, I've seen people who say that it reads a lot better in the original Russian, so it's mostly a translation issue, so I won't hold that too much against it. But even putting aside the writing, the book itself, well, I can only describe it as very jumbled. Yeskov describes his creative process as graphomania, and reading the book, you definitely get the sense that he had all these different ideas while writing it that made perfect sense in his head, but when put together, they feel rather incoherent. And I don't mean that as too much of a dig. My own creative process is quite similar, but sometimes it really shows. I don't even know how I would begin to describe The Last Ringbearer. I guess the first thing to note is that it isn't actually a retelling of The Lord of the Rings. That would imply that we have the same events from a different perspective. It would be more accurate to describe this as a sequel. At the beginning of the book, Mordor has been defeated. King Elessar is about to carry out his final solution to the Mordorian problem. And it's up to our heroes, who are just a handful of random soldiers from Mordor, to try and stop him. The version of Middle-earth that we see here is, on one hand, a lot more grounded and realistic than in the Lord of the Rings. The idea is that in the Red Book of Westmarch, things have been heavily romanticized, and this version is closer to the truth. The orcs and trolls aren't actually these fantasy creatures, they're just normal humans who have been portrayed as monsters in Gondor propaganda. Sauron isn't actually an immortal Maya. Mordor has just had a long string of kings, all named Sauron. The current one is Sauron VIII, known for his universal literacy law. And the One Ring isn't actually special in any way whatsoever. The whole journey with the ring was just a very complicated web of propaganda and misinformation. So you might be thinking, okay, we're going for a more grounded, realistic approach, but no. Magic and elves and wizards still play a very big role in the plot. Yeskov invents an entire alternate cosmology for Middle-earth. God, I really wish I'd bought a conspiracy board, but I'll try my best to summarize it. Essentially, we have two realms, Middle-earth, which is the mundane world where humans live, and Aman, the magical world where all the elves come from, which so far is vaguely in line with the actual Tolkien Legendarium. But then things get a bit skewed. The two worlds are naturally separate from each other. Travel between them is mediated by the wizards. And at first, they kept a pretty good balance. But a group of them became utterly enamored by Aman, and they wanted to recreate Middle-earth in its image as this totally static place where everything is peaceful and harmonious, but no one has any real agency, and humanity would be totally under the thumb of the elves. This group of wizards became the White Council, and they managed to totally bend the backwards kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan to their will, to enact their final plan of total elven supremacy. But another group of wizards was horrified by this plan. They went down to Mordor and guided them to become an opposing force, a civilization dedicated to reason and progress and technology. And as Mordor advanced, the White Council saw that eventually it will be able to defeat them, so they had to make the first strike, to start a war and implement the final solution to the Mordorian problem. And from here, we enter into a whole web of different plots and subplots and random dumps of exposition. In terms of the tone of the whole thing, I guess the easiest comparison would be to the Witcher books by Andrzej Sapkowski. The cynical outlook, the dark humor, the way it depicts the gritty lives of everyday people stuck in the machinations of these grand political actors who are portrayed as being comically pompous and out of touch. 1990s Poland, 1990s Russia, it was a very similar zeitgeist. But that actually all ended up being a point against it for me, because the whole time I was reading The Last Ringbearer, I was thinking to myself, wow, The Witcher does this so much better. I wish I was reading those books instead. It is worth reiterating again that this is a very jumbled book. In the first part, we're set up with this complicated plan to disrupt the White Council and stop them from enslaving Middle-earth by using their own magic against them. But then, for most of the middle of the book, that plan takes a complete pause so we can do a bunch of spy subplots down in Umber, only to reappear at the very end, by which point I had totally stopped caring about anything that had happened. It made a lot of sense, I assume, in Kirill Yeskov's head and nowhere else. But in between all of this, there's also long segments of pure exposition. We learn all about the different politics and economics, and even the geology and weather patterns of Yeskov's version of Middle-earth. And actually, I found this to be a lot more interesting than the actual storyline. And, maybe I'm not representative of the average reader. I actually quite enjoy the parts of the Witcher books that were just explaining currency devaluation. But it's also in the exposition that we get what we really came here for, to see the Lord of the Rings told from an alternate perspective. It's kind of exciting to hear Eskov explain about how the quest with Frodo was just a distraction, how Aragorn was a tool of the elves who murdered and manipulated his way to becoming King of Gondor. It's very convenient that Boromir just happened to die in Aragorn's company, that Denethor just decided to set himself on fire while Gandalf was the only witness. It is all set up in a way that feels strangely fitting. The Lord of the Rings sets up this extremely detailed and, in many ways, realistic world. But when it comes to moral alignment, as it were, things feel very simple. There's a lot of characters who can be boiled down to just being pure good or pure evil. Yes, there are exceptions, like, say, Boromir or Gollum, but they're exceptions. The overall distribution is a lot more polarized than anything in real life, and this has always bothered a lot of people about Middle-earth. And one of those people is Kirill Eskov. He wrote out a whole essay where he explained his intentions with The Last Ringbearer. Essentially, he really admired Tolkien as a world builder, but has some issues with his storytelling. Actually, that's putting it a bit lightly. He describes this conflict between good and evil as pure romanticism, as having the moral simplicity of an American action movie, being fit only for children, with the strong implication that he has improved the story, made it something fit for literate adults to read. And, well, you might not be able to tell by looking, but I am something of a Tolkien fan, and this type of analysis just feels rather shallow and obnoxious. Tolkien knew full well that in the real world, the lines between good and evil aren't clear-cut. There are orcs, as it were, on both sides. He chose to set up the book this way because it helped to emphasize the themes he wanted to explore. To take the type of moral dilemmas that are very muddled and nuanced in the real world and present them in a way that has more clarity. To take the type of conflicts that usually take place internally within us and externalize them. A character like Aragorn might be this somewhat unrealistic paragon of virtue, but you could say the same about Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, at least after his encounter with Bishop Muriel. And Sauron is basically this personification of evil who has no psychological complexity as an actual character, but the same approach has been taken with other antagonists in literary fiction, like, say, the Judge in Blood Meridian. Now, you're not obligated to like the way it's done. There's always room for critique. But at the bare minimum, you have to acknowledge that there's intentionality there. Asking the question, oh, what if the bad guy was actually the good guy, isn't actually as deep as you think it is. Just look at Disney's Cruella de Vil movie. You need to be actually engaging with the themes of the work in some way. So, when most people hear that there's a Russian retelling of The Lord of the Rings with Mordor as the good guys, usually they assume that it's making some statement about one of the prominent motifs in Lord of the Rings, which is East versus West civilizational conflict. Now, Russia, depending on who you're asking and what context, could be considered part of the East or part of the West, but in the context of recent history and the Cold War, it is definitively the epicenter of the East, portrayed in Western propaganda as an evil empire in a way very analogous to Mordor in The Lord of the Rings. So you could see the Last Ringbearer as a post-Soviet Russian clapping back and giving his own side of it. And before I continue, and before my comment section gets flooded up, it's important to note that none of this was actually part of Tolkien's intentions. His own views on geopolitics were very isolationist. He did not believe that the West had any business interfering in the East. He saw European imperialism as being, in essence, rather orcish behavior. But earlier I brought up the idea of the death of the author, that the author's actual intentions don't really matter. The only thing that's important is what's in the actual text of the book itself. In modern parlance, the term death of the author is used mostly when people want to enjoy a work by an author who's considered problematic and don't want to feel guilty about it. But the concept also goes the other way. If you take The Lord of the Rings at its most literal, it is the story of these pale, heroic aristocrats from the West waging a war of total extermination against the savage, subhuman hordes of the East. And for the people who latch on to this reading, either because they're criticizing it or because they see their own views reflected in it, it's hard to refute them just using the text itself in isolation. In reality, these implications were totally accidental on Tolkien's part. They weren't part of his intentions. But if we accept the death of the author, then that doesn't matter. The burden was on him to make his intentions clear within the actual text. But, unfortunately, if you go into The Last Ringbearer hoping for a more socially conscious alternative to The Lord of the Rings, then you'll be disappointed, because this book is, if anything, way more racist. So a big part of The Last Ringbearer is vindicating the orcs, who are portrayed as this kind of always evil race in the Tolkien Legendarium, and which a lot of people consider to be reminiscent of various racial stereotypes. But the thing is, Tolkien also wrote about various human groups who served Mordor, the Easterlings and the Haradrim. And we don't hear a whole lot about them. On one hand, Tolkien does famously emphasize that they are nuanced people who aren't necessarily pure evil like the orcs. But on the other hand, what we're actually told about them is mostly just a hodgepodge of stereotypes about people outside of Europe. And The Last Ringbearer is not concerned with examining this at all. It turns all of those stereotypes up to 11. The book spends a lot of time with the Haradrim, who we're very obviously supposed to see as stand-ins for sub-Saharan Africans. They have names like Umbanga and Umdikva. They have a whole history of being the victims of the slave trade. It's not subtle at all. And nearly all of them throughout the book are just portrayed as unintelligent, bloodthirsty brutes. It's so over the top that I assumed it was some kind of satire. You know, at the end there'd be some big subversion where we learn that all of our stereotypes were unfounded. But then that never actually happens. If it was meant as a parody or a deconstruction, then that's one of those ideas that he had and put in the book, but forgot to do anything with it. We actually do get a final mention of race in the epilogue. He imagines that in the far future, people in Middle-earth will make a movie of this whole thing, and this is how he describes it. The movie's artistic merits are scant, but it's totally politically correct. Alvis is black, Harado-Armentian, and the relationship between Tangorn and Gregor has distinct gay overtones. The critics predicted as one man that the judges of the Silver Harbour's Film Festival would protect themselves from the charges of racism, sexism, and other horrible isms by throwing every conceivable award at it, which is exactly what happened. So, if there ever somehow is a movie adaptation of The Last Ringbearer, I know what would be the funniest thing to do. So, there's another spin to the geopolitical interpretation of The Last Ringbearer. Especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been people who interpret it as essentially nationalist propaganda. The idea is that it appeals to this sense of victimhood, that Russia is the poor, beleaguered East being attacked and oppressed by the relentless West, and then this is used as a moral excuse to do whatever they want. Any kind of chauvinism and expansionism is justified because the West was being mean to Russia and that's all that matters. And when it comes to this reading, well, first of all, it is worth noting that, as of a few years ago at least, Kirill Eskov was voicing his political opinions on the internet. And I did have to run it through Google Translate, which isn't entirely accurate, but it is pretty overwhelmingly clear that he's a very cynical guy, and he feels no loyalty to Putin or any faith in the special military operation. And he actually did stumble upon the articles accusing him of being a pro-war propagandist, and his response was essentially to call the authors complete idiots. And then, even putting aside authorial intent, if you try to read Mordor in The Last Ringbearer as a straightforward allegory for Russia, then, well, there's certainly certain parts you can point to, but on the whole, I just don't think it holds up. A huge part of the premise is even setting up Mordor as advanced and industrial, in contrast to the primitive and agrarian Gondor and Rohan. And this is basically the complete reverse of your typical East versus West narrative. I think it's a bit of a mistake to assume that the retelling of The Lord of the Rings by a Russian guy is necessarily about Russia. You might primarily associate Russia with Cold War geopolitics, but that isn't really what most Russians spend all day thinking about. When it comes to the main themes and ideas of The Last Ringbearer, I think it is something that easily could have come out of the West. In fact, I'd say it fits in quite well with a pre-existing genre. The Last Ringbearer is a rat fic. Now, if you're a normal, healthy person, then that combination of syllables will mean absolutely nothing to you. But it is short for rational fiction, which is a kind of genre of fanfiction that started in, well, actually, now that I think about it, the first rat fic was really a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. But as we know it, it starts in 2010 with Eliezer Yudkowsky's Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. And you can go on for hours and hours and hours about Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality and the whole subculture it spawned, but that is a can of worms that we don't have time for now. Eskov was writing The Last Ringbearer a decade before any of that, but he was coming at things from a very similar angle. The rationalists, I guess you could best describe them as a particularly nerdy outgrowth of the new atheist movement. And Eskov, before he wrote The Last Ringbearer, came out with The Gospel of Afranius, a parody retelling of the life of Jesus, so he definitely fit in with that crowd. And the main thing about ratfics is that they have this very particular storytelling style that appeals to that sensibility. These are usually fanfictions of existing sci-fi and fantasy media, and for one, they usually have a bunch of extra world-building attached. Things are reinterpreted to be more logically consistent. If there's a magic system, then you bet the protagonist is going to learn all of the rules and find a way to exploit loopholes to his own advantage. And obviously, The Last Ringbearer is full of this. According to Eskov, his initial inspiration for writing this is that he noticed how odd it is that Mordor is this highly populated civilization in the middle of the desert. You know, what do they actually eat? So he sets out this whole explanation involving supply chains and climate change and how all of this is essential to understanding the War of the Ring, and you can read the book if you're actually interested in that, but it goes on a bit. He is very excited about that. Though it's unfortunate, or maybe it actually is kind of fortunate, that Eskov interprets Middle-earth as a completely separate secondary world. He seems to be unaware that Tolkien intended it as a prehistoric version of our own Earth. If Eskov had known that, I feel like he would have had a lot of fun incorporating that into all of the world building. And when it comes to magic, well, let's just say there's a lot of loopholes exploited in how they actually end up defeating the White Council. Another big feature of Ratfix is that they're dedicated to spreading the ideals of rationality and scientific inquiry, which often puts them at odds with more romantic aspects of the original work. Tolkien was famously highly distrustful of technology and bureaucracy. Mordor and Isengard essentially serve as warnings for where he feels the modern world was heading. But The Last Ringbearer flips the script. It says, well, if Mordor represents modern industrialism, then that means it has advanced medicine, education, democracy. It might not be perfect there, but surely it's a lot better than living as a feudal peasant in Gondor or Rohan. There's a very exciting battle of ideas to be had here, but I don't think we really end up getting it. Again, the bulk of The Last Ringbearer is spent doing spy stuff in Umber in a way that has nothing to do with anything. But even looking at the more salient parts, I'm not sure if there's a lot of depth to it. Eskov plays up how great industrialization is, but he never really responds to any of the specific critiques Tolkien makes. I'm especially thinking about C.S. Lewis, and to all my returning viewers, don't worry, I will get back around to my Space Trilogy series. But Lewis in many ways says explicitly what Tolkien weaves more implicitly into his work. And I'm especially thinking about The Abolition of Man, where he talks about how technology doesn't really give man power over nature, so much as it gives certain men power over the rest of mankind. And to be clear, I don't think this is an infallible point. Once I finally get around to my video on That Hideous Strength, I'll have a lot of critiques about The Abolition of Man. But it's the type of thing that you really have to engage with it to pull it apart, and that's something that Eskov fundamentally isn't interested in. Maybe I'm being a little bit uncharitable, but you get the feeling that he's so confident in his own superiority over Tolkien that he doesn't feel the need to actually engage with any of the ideas. And actually, now that I think about it, I don't think I'm being unfair at all. Remember when I said that Eskov wrote this book because he didn't understand how Mordor got its food, and he saw that as a problem that needed to be fixed? Well, that problem never would have happened if he had just read Lord of the Rings a bit more closely. Return of the King. I don't like the look of things at all, said Sam. Pretty hopeless, I call it. Saving that where there's such a lot of folks there must be wells or water, not to mention food. And these are men, not orcs, or my eyes are all wrong. Neither he nor Frodo knew anything of the great slave-worked fields away down south in this wide realm, beyond the fumes of the mountain by the dark, sad waters of Lake Nurnen, nor of the great roads that ran away east and south to tributary lands, from which the soldiers of the tower brought long wagon trains of goods and booty and fresh slaves. But the problem is, no matter how much I try to pull apart The Last Ringbearer, Kirill Eskov has me epically owned, because this is how he ends the book. In other words, guys, live and let live. In our case, it translates to this: You don't have to listen to me spin tall tales if you don't like them. So, I guess we should just move on. I'm putting an interlude here, mostly because I filmed this across 2 days, and I changed up the lighting and camera angle across the 2 days, so it would seem a bit jarring if I just suddenly switched from one to the other. But anyway, I just realized that if I wanted to be timely, I should have themed this whole thing around Wicked, since it's the revisionist retelling that'll be most on people's minds. But the more I think about it, I just don't think Wicked is any good as a retelling. It's the middle of the video, I'm already interrupting everything, and I don't have any sponsor, so I guess I can just rant about this instead. First of all, I should say that on its own, I think the Wicked musical is perfectly fine. But the whole concept of the story, going back to the Wicked book by Gregory Maguire, you have to really ask, what's the actual point of it? In the same way that Eskov obviously has lots of things to say about Tolkien, what does Maguire have to say about L. Frank Baum? In interviews, he said that his original goal with Wicked was to explore the concept of evil, and especially how a seemingly regular person can become evil. His original plan was to write a book about Hitler, but then he realized he'd be a bit out of his depth, so he decided that the next best thing was the Wicked Witch of the West. In the original Wizard of Oz book, the Wicked Witch of the West is this oppressive leader in charge of an expansionist empire, so it makes sense. But at a certain point of the writing process, he seems to have lost track of this original goal, and he forgot to actually make Elphaba evil. Now, of course, the Elphaba of Wicked the book does become a lot more unhinged than the Elphaba of Wicked the musical, but even at her worst, she's hardly a Hitlerian figure. That role ends up being shifted on to the wizard, compared to whom she is unambiguously the lesser evil. So, what is the purpose of that? The story plays up the oppression of the animals as its main source of conflict, so you would imagine that this is a commentary on something within the original, something akin to the problem of the orcs in the Tolkien Legendarium. But as far as I can tell, and let me know if there's some obscure Oz book that contradicts this, because there's so many of them, but in all of them, there's nothing problematic about its depiction of the talking animals. They're just accepted as regular citizens of Oz like anyone else. Maguire just completely invented this conflict so he'd have a way to make Elphaba more sympathetic. And maybe there's some other angles you can take. It's easy to assume that Wicked is meant to have a feminist message. It takes this one-dimensional female antagonist, but states that she's actually been misrepresented. But for all the media properties that you could tell this story with, L. Frank Baum's Oz is a bizarre choice. This is a world that's full of powerful women, many of whom are portrayed very positively. So it's kind of weird to ignore all of them just to hyper-focus on the Wicked Witch of the West. It obviously has resonated with a lot of people, but it's in this awkward position where the more you know about the original going into it, the more you examine the story from that angle, it makes the whole thing a lot shallower. Maguire easily could have made Wicked as a remake of any other children's fantasy story, or he could have made it a completely original work set in its own universe. As an original story, it has its merits, but as a remake, it's really kind of pointless. But by now, you've hopefully forgotten what the old camera angle looked like, so let's move on. The Black Book of Arda. My original plan was to just make a video about Kirill Eskov's The Last Ringbearer, It seemed like it'd be a fun, relatively short video. But then I remembered, wait a second, isn't there that other Russian retelling of the Tolkien Legendarium? You see, post-Soviet Russia rapidly saw the rise of a large and passionate Tolkien fandom. Something about that time and place really made people want to escape into a world of fantasy. And mixed with the lax copyright laws, there were people before Eskov who had the exact same idea. The Black Book of Arda was written by Natalia Vasilyeva and Natalia Nekrasova. And I've done a few takes, and I think that's about as good as my pronunciation's gonna get. But they're better known within the fandom as Niena and Ilyet. And together, they produced a retelling of Tolkien's Silmarillion, taking the perspective of Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, to whom Sauron was only a lieutenant. However, there's never been an official English translation, so it's a lot less well known in the Western fandom. It's the type of thing you very occasionally see someone offhand mention in some forum post, so for a long time it's had the allure of some secret esoteric knowledge. And I thought, if I'm making a video about the Last Ringbearer, I might as well scrunch up whatever information I can and give it a brief shout out. Well, it turns out that I last went looking for a translation several years ago, and in the meantime, the situation has changed. There is a full English translation of the Black Book of Arda up on the Internet Archive, uploaded by FTG 1992. But the translator themselves admits that it's a very flawed work with lots of errors. It was translated from a Portuguese version, which in turn came from the original Russian, so there's a bit of a game of telephone going on. It reads well enough that you can get the general gist of what's going on, but it can be a bit hard to interpret sometimes. And considering that the whole book is 600 pages long, well, it's a lot to get through, and I'll admit that I did not really understand all of it. But there's another translation by Tia Nauro on AO3, going through it chapter by chapter. It's still on the early parts of the book, but it's probably the best English version out there at the moment. And while I was doing research, I actually got in touch with the translator Nauro directly, and she was kind enough to answer a lot of my questions and clarify a lot of the gaps in my understanding, so a huge thank you there. I imagine most people who clicked on this video are already acquainted with the Silmarillion, but to be safe, it is the Bible of the Tolkien Legendarium, telling of the creation and early history of Middle-earth. And the story is, well, again, very biblical. Tolkien was a devout Roman Catholic, and he fed a lot of that into the Legendarium. The main antagonist is the Dark Lord Melkor/Morgoth, who, since the beginning of time, has been in rebellion against the one true god Eru Iluvatar. He is, very straightforwardly, a satanic figure. And I could go on about how it's such a bold and subversive move to portray Satan as a hero, but let's be honest, it's 2025, you've seen this before. Around the same time that the Black Book of Arda was published, we also had Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, which takes a very similar standpoint. If you read the Old Testament and you always see God giving people arbitrary orders and then raining natural disasters upon them, you start to think that this guy doesn't seem very chill. And if this is the guy that Satan is rebelling against, then maybe he has a point. Now, obviously, a Christian like Tolkien would have some counter-arguments to this. He believed that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Anything he does will ultimately turn out for the best, even if it's not obvious at the moment. By rebelling against God, Satan/Melkor twists himself into a creature of pure hate and envy, while failing to make any dent at all in the divine plan. But the skeptic can just ask, how do you really know that God is good? How can you really know that his will actually turn out for the best? You can see Tolkien's fiction as a response to the cynicism and uncertainty of the modern world, a manifesto for faith and traditional values. And in that way, The Last Ringbearer and the Black Book of Arda represent modernity striking back, taking those works and getting their grubby little cynicism and uncertainties all over it to undermine those very traditional values. The Last Ringbearer was very focused on the big picture, the world building, fleshing out these socioeconomic institutions to put an emphasis on all the cynical realpolitik. But the Black Book of Arda functions on a much more personal level. The Silmarillion is a story about gods and heroes, and they are portrayed in the same epic proportions you'd expect in any old myth or legend. But the Black Book of Arda brings them down to the level of mere relatable people. If you open up the book, well, I guess the first thing you'll notice is that both translations keep a lot of the style and format of the original, which includes a lot of stuff that's less common in English, like using dashes instead of quotation marks for dialogue. But then, really, the main thing you'll notice is the prose style. In very sharp contrast to The Last Ringbearer, it's written in this very flowing, descriptive style. One example I can give, taking from Nowro's translation, is a description of the world as it was right before Melkor destroys the two lamps. A symmetrical world without any mountains or vales. Rivers cannot flow here, and lakes become fens, surface covered with algae and duckweed, and they bloom unrestrained, and in them strange small slimy creatures squirm, and a heavy golden-green fog curls over the fens, spreading over the ground, the suffocating smell of decay, and the thick, almost tangible scent of the fen blooms. Plants intertwine, twist, crawl, squeeze each other in a deadly embrace, and in the twilight woods, dark mosses eat away at the trees, leprosy-like in their hunger, and the stains of toxic yellow mold on their gnarled roots are golden ulcers, and the trees rot alive, and the animals go mad. Such was the spring of Arda. Such was Arda as Melkor had seen it. He cradled his head between his hands. The world was screaming. The first cry of a newborn became a furious howl, and a dying gasp. Arda was moaning in agony, like a woman unable to give birth. The fire, her life, was burning her from within. This reads very differently from Tolkien's Silmarillion, which has this sort of elegant but simple prose. Again, it's very biblical in the way it just describes events without dwelling on them too much. By contrast, the Black Book of Arda is much more descriptive, much more lyrical. When I was speaking with Nowro about how it reads in the original Russian, she confirmed that it's a very distinctive and iconic style. For her, the closest point of comparison is in what's known as the Silver Age of Russian poetry around the turn of the century. She brought up Marina Tsvetaeva as an example who's probably best known in the English world. And this style is used to linger on the inner lives of the characters, to explore their thoughts and emotions at a level far beyond what we see in the published Silmarillion. The early parts of the book follow Melkor around as he follows his creative impulses and remakes the world around him. The original Silmarillion adheres to Tolkien's Catholic beliefs, so Melkor, acting against God's will, can't actually create anything of his own. He can only twist and corrupt what God has already provided. But the Black Book of Arda follows an alternate version of biblical cosmology, taking from Catholicism's original enemy, the first heresy, Gnosticism. Now, if you actually want to learn about Gnosticism, well, this isn't esoterica. I'm sure Justin Sledge has talked about this way better than I ever could. But to give a simple version, God is an idiot. He has no immaculate plan. He created this world just because he wants total control, to have a bunch of people he can play around with like dolls. The only person who's caught on to this is Satan, the snake in the garden, who's trying to give us the proper knowledge so we can liberate ourselves. And of course, actual Gnosticism was a lot more complicated than this. A lot of historians hate even using the term Gnostic because it actually refers to a bunch of separate sects who had, in many cases, nothing to do with each other. But in popular culture, the idea of Gnosticism has taken on a life of its own, far removed from any actual historical practice. It's a twin to the Christianity we know today, which promotes a doctrine which seems, on the surface at least, a lot more free-thinking and anti-authoritarian. Something that asks you to be skeptical and figure out the truth for yourself rather than blindly trusting authority. And especially to modern atheists and humanists, this idea is very appealing. You also see elements of Gnostic cosmology in his Dark Materials, and the Gnostics, or at least an ahistoric portrayal of them, are portrayed as heroic figures in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And when it comes to Melkor, all of the actions that in the Silmarillion are framed as being motivated by pure malice and destruction, or in the Black Book of Arda, contextualized as him trying to fix the divine plan, to give life, to give free will to this stale, barren world that Eru Iluvatar has dreamed up, exactly like we saw in the passage about the destruction of the lamps. But we also get passages from the point of view of the Valar. Many of them are tempted by Melkor. What he's doing seems intuitively correct, but following Tolkien's moral framework, they also believe that they have to follow God's will no matter what. They wage war against Melkor, they destroy his creations and imprison him. He becomes a classic persecuted martyr, and we're not even close to even being halfway done. The book continues all the way through the War of the Jewels and the War of Wrath and a little bit afterwards. Melkor is the main character, but we also get sections from the point of view of Sauron, from the point of view of Angban's enemies, from the point of view of various relatively minor characters who are too unimportant for the Silmarillion to have mentioned. The torture and death that Melkor inflicts in the Silmarillion is still largely acknowledged, but it's put in the context of him defending himself in this great war of destruction. The idea is that the original Silmarillion has exaggerated his crimes, while leaving out all the provocations that led him to that point. And this feels not like a takedown of the Silmarillion, but like all the best fanfiction, like it's using the framework of the original as a basis to tell lots of new stories. And this very much is fan fiction. Whereas The Last Ringbearer would become much more well-known among general audiences, it's the Black Book of Arda which really made a splash within the fandom. And again, thank you to the translator Naro for giving me some of this information. The only other research method I had was looking stuff up in Russian and then running it through Google Translate, which is not always ideal. The Black Book of Arda created an extremely devoted fanbase within a fanbase. They were often called the Neonists for the primary author of the book. And they had their own community and fan works. There's even a Melkor rock opera musical out there based on the Black Book of Arda. And this also shouldn't be confused with Finrod, which is a completely different Russian Tolkien-inspired rock opera musical. When I say that Russia has a large and dedicated Tolkien fandom, I really mean it. And you can probably imagine that there were also a lot of people who didn't take fondly to this complete revisionism of Tolkien's works. To its haters, the Black Book of Arda is a self-indulgent fanfiction for teenage girls who, for whatever reason, want to read about a Dark Lord moping around feeling angsty for 600 pages. They were furious that a large portion of the fandom was more dedicated to this than the actual works of Tolkien. There were fights about it, there was high drama, and you better bet there's think pieces out there. Unsurprisingly, the Black Book of Arda has been accused of being satanic. There's also a fun essay accusing it of subverting traditional gender roles. By portraying mopey, effeminate men and strong warrior women, it'll confuse the youth and lead to the total downfall of society. Even the authors of the Black Book of Arda grew rather dissatisfied with it. A lot of it came from the feeling that they went a bit too far in heroicizing Melkor and villainizing the elves. One of the authors, Ilyet, left the project altogether and went back to making fanworks that were more in line with Tolkien's canon. The other author, Nienna, came out with several revised editions that make lots of tweaks to the lore and generally aren't as well regarded by the fanbase. Both of the translations into English are based on the first edition. There's even a few digs at the Black Book of Arda in another major published fanfiction, Beyond the Dawn by the Ukrainian author Olga Brylyeva. This is essentially a darker, grittier retelling of the tale of Beren and Luthien, but it still keeps Angband as a villainous force, and it brings in some characters from the Black Book of Arda portrayed in a less positive light. And this isn't even getting into the other big published Russian fanfiction, The Ring of Darkness by Nick Perimov. This is a sequel set 300 years after The Lord of the Rings, with a new apocalyptic threat rising. Most of the reviews I've read are pretty mixed. It seems to reimagine the Tolkien Legendarium in some interesting ways, but on the whole, the story seems to be regarded as rather generic and derivative. And honestly, I would love to keep talking about the Russian Tolkien fandom. There is definitely multiple hours of content that can be said about it, preferably by someone who actually speaks Russian and can actually do research about it, because as it is, I already feel way out of my depths. So let's keep moving on. Morlindalë. So I thought I had a pretty good idea to make a video about those crazy Russians always reimagining the Lord of the Rings. But while I was looking for some forum posts on the Black Book of Arda, I saw someone mention something called Morlindalë. So I had a look at it, and then I dug closer, and I realized, well, I can't not talk about this. Morlindalë is a retelling of the Silmarillion, which was written in English, and just looking at it, there's a few odd things that stick out. The first thing is that it's actually openly up for sale on Amazon, and the lawyers haven't taken it down. As far as I can tell, it was originally put online as a fanfiction, but then the author took that down in order to sell it as a book, marketing it as a parody to avoid copyright law, and somehow that's worked so far. You might also notice that there are two authors listed, the Baron Rakane and the One Ring. So this book came out right after the Lord of the Rings films, and the framing device is that the author purchased himself a replica of the One Ring, and as soon as he put it on, he felt suddenly compelled to write this text. And as to who the Baron Rakane is, we'll get around to that. The book is written as a series of letters written on scrolls, from Melkor to Sauron, and then from Sauron to the Blue Wizard Palondo, giving the Dark Lord's perspective on the events of the Silmarillion, the fall of Numenor, and the War of the Ring. The whole thing is very similar to the Black Book of Arda. You have Melkor as this free thinker being shunned and oppressed by the Valar. You even have a prose style that's, well, maybe not completely similar, but in the same vein, more or less, more flowing and descriptive in contrast to the archaic style of the Silmarillion. When again the gates of Mandos opened for me, I hardly knew myself still to be. Within Mandos there is no light, no sound, no motion, no other thing at all. Imprisoned there, I slowly began to unform, until I was but a mere thought that clung only to itself. It was this fragile wisp that the Valar found when finally they chose to release me, and they laughed as they sent it drifting back to Mahanahar. You might even wonder if there's some sort of plagiarism going on, but, well, first of all, I've got no clue if the Baron Rakane even spoke Russian, but even so, the spirit is very similar to the Black Book of Arda, but the way events actually play out is quite different. Probably the most notable broad difference is that the Melkor victimization complex is turned up to 11. The Black Book of Arda kept some level of moral ambiguity, but in Morlindalë, Sauron and Melkor are really emphasized as these great guys who never did anything wrong in their entire lives, and they are then being oppressed and attacked by the Valar out of some senseless hatred. It all seems rather over the top, but then again, the whole thing is written from their perspective, literally as a series of letters written by Melkor and Sauron, so of course their perspective might be a bit skewed. Much more so than the Last Ringbearer or the Black Book of Arda, you could really imagine Morlindalë existing within the same universe as the Red Book of Westmarch, and it's really up to you to decide which one you think is closer to the truth. Reading this book, another big thing you'll notice is that the Baron Rakane really knows his Tolkien. There's lots of stuff in there that I felt was kind of contrived, but then when I look it up, it turns out that it's actually some deep cut to an early draft in the history of Middle-earth. Stuff like Melkor having a wife named Ulbondi, which at first I just assumed was something completely made up, but nope, that's actually from Tolkien. There's also footnotes tying it into real-world history. Mount Doom is apparently synonymous with Mount Etna in Sicily. The Valar all have analogues in real-world religion. Morgoth, of course, is equivalent to the Abrahamic Satan and the Egyptian Set. And the book itself is also quite short. The version I obtained came out to around 70 pages, which is probably for the best. The whole thing is rather intriguing, but I didn't feel a whole lot of depth to it. If it went on for much longer, it probably would have overstayed its welcome. Overall, I'd say I judge it very highly in its original form as a piece of fanfiction up for free on the internet. But as an actual book that people are supposed to pay money for, my opinion's a bit more middling. On its own, I probably would have given Morlindalë just a brief mention. But then there's the Baron Rakane. As far as I can tell, this is an actual noble title in Scotland, but he didn't inherit it, he purchased it from its previous owner. The Baron Rakane is better known as the late Michael Aquino. He was an officer in the US military who became a specialist in psychological warfare during the Vietnam War. And if that sounds a bit spooky to you, then just you wait, because in 1969 he joined the Church of Satan founded by Anton LaVey. The church's beliefs are laid out in documents like the Satanic Bible. But in essence, they're not actual Satanists. It is an atheistic religion that sees Satan as a symbol of strength and rebellion. Anton LaVey saw traditional Christian morality as essentially a tool of weak men to keep down the strong. Instead, he promoted raw indulgence and ambition. LaVeyan Satanism is in many ways very similar to Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, but it has a lot more of a sense of humor to it. I definitely get the sense that Anton LaVey would be a lot more fun at parties than Ayn Rand. The Church of Satan also shouldn't be confused with the more modern Satanic Temple. This is also an atheistic organization that promotes Satan as a symbol, but its vibes are a lot more progressive and inclusive. You can think of it as Unitarian Universalism for people who shop at Hot Topic. Michael Aquino rose through the ranks of the Church of Satan, but pretty soon a major difference of opinion arose, being that Aquino was an actual Satanist. He actually believed that he had a true diabolical mission, whereas Anton LaVey was mostly out there to make some quick bucks off his notoriety. So, a schism occurred. Michael Aquino declared that the Church of Satan had become corrupt and materialistic, so he founded the Temple of Set. The origin of the name is apparently that Satan came to Aquino and let him know that he preferred to be known by his Egyptian name, rather than what the Israelites called him. So Michael Aquino was a psyop specialist who was also a satanic high priest, and as you can imagine, this gave rise to a lot of conspiracy theories. But a lot of these are just wild speculation with no evidence behind them. You know, if you look at his Wikipedia page, the first thing you'll notice is the very eyebrow-raising section, child molestation allegations. But it doesn't take very long into actually reading it to figure out that it's a satanic panic case with a similar level of evidence as the McMartin preschool trial. Now, I definitely wouldn't discount out of hand that Michael Aquino might have been involved in some shady business. Just as I'm editing this video, I've run across some of his more contrarian writings on World War II, which raise a few red flags. But on the whole, he seemed mostly just like a bit of a dork. He wrote satanic rituals that invoked gods from the Lovecraft mythos. In addition to Morlindalë, he also wrote Fire Force, a Star Wars parody, and Ode to Esme, the Memoirs of Captain Nemo. And in all of this, you can definitely see echoes of his religious beliefs. When I got my hands on Morlindalë, I expected to find myself in the middle of some grand battle of ideas. I thought that if I read this book along with the sacred texts of the Temple of Set, I thought I would uncover some grand theological, philosophical design that would be the ultimate antithesis to the Catholic Silmarillion. But I tried to read his religious text, and it turns out Satanism is really boring. All of these left-hand path occultist traditions just sound the complete same to me, I'm sorry. It's basically just some existentialist philosophy, the power of believing yourself, of making your own values and creating your own purpose in life, with a bunch of spooky aesthetics added on top of it. He even rejects a lot of the spicier elements of LaVeyan Satanism, like its inversion of traditional morality. Aquino basically loops his way into preaching that a proper Satanist will also be a productive, compassionate, and ethical member of society. Morlindalë is more or less a shorter, simpler version of the Black Book of Arda. It comes off as a straightforward fable about the wise and enlightened few being kept down by the oppressive establishment. Maybe if you're more plugged into the occult world, you can pick up on some stuff that I missed. There's definitely this idea of perfect symmetry that plays into the cosmology of Morlindalë, but I couldn't make heads or tails of its actual significance. Oh yeah, and the final thing that I kind of have to mention about Morlindalë is the art. So far, I've avoided showing you its cover, and that's because it looks like this. I don't know what you were expecting, but I imagine that anime-inspired DeviantArt post wasn't it. There are illustrations in this style throughout the book, and they are credited to Aldona Kalinovska. According to Michael Aquino, she made some fan art when he first posted Morlindalë online, and he liked it so much that he asked for more. Her style has a certain porcelain quality, with perhaps a hint of Japanese understatement. At first, it surprised me, but the more I looked at it, the more it fit. Which, I guess he might have a point. When I see a style like this, I think early 2000s teenagers on DeviantArt. But if you come into it without those preconceived associations, then I suppose you would see the porcelain quality, the Japanese understatement. It's definitely rather stylized rather than representational, but so is plenty of good art. If a satanic high priest thinks that it's fitting, then who am I to argue? Conclusion. I could keep going with this for a while longer. There's other published works like The Sundering by Jacqueline Carey, which tells the typical Tolkien-esque fantasy epic of the forces of light fighting against the forces of darkness, with the twist that the story is told from the perspective of the forces of darkness. However, I felt like it just didn't really fit into this project. It obviously takes some inspiration from the Tolkien Legendarium. Satoris obviously has some basis in Sauron, but it's all very loose. The Sundering adds a bunch of backstory and plot lines that don't really have anything to do with The Lord of the Rings. It's less a response to Tolkien specifically, and more a general subversion of the stereotypical Tolkien-esque fantasy tropes, which is a bit different from what we've been talking about today. And by the same measure, I'm sure there's also plenty of smaller fanfictions out there which reimagine the Tolkien Legendarium in some new and interesting way. If there's any that stand out, make sure to tell me about them in the comments. And if you're a Russian speaker, or a practicing occultist, or anyone else who has more insight on what I've been talking about, then also make sure to leave a comment. I went back and forth on what would be the best way to conclude this video. Derivative fiction is about as old as fiction itself. When you have characters and settings and plot lines that the audience has already encountered before, then that gives the storyteller a lot of opportunities to play around with their pre-existing expectations and emotional attachments in a way that goes beyond what you can do with merely an original story. And there are definitely times when this can be used as a crutch. Selling people on a mediocre story because it has a connection to something actually good that they have a pre-existing attachment to. But other times, we get the Aeneid, Paradise Lost, the Once and Future King, Jesus Christ Superstar. It's not a simple, all good or all bad. And then we get to something like the Last Ringbearer, the Black Book of Arda, or Morlindalë. Something that totally revises the source material and flips the original premise on its head. How exactly should we make sense of that? You could see that as a direct insult on the source material, and there have been times when that was the case. Just think about Paul Verhoeven's adaptation of Starship Troopers, or you could go all the way back to Henry Fielding's An Apology for the Life of Mrs. Shamala Andrews. But that hasn't really been the intention of any of what we've talked about today. Even Kirill Eskov says that he doesn't want The Last Ringbearer to be a replacement for The Lord of the Rings. Though he also does imply that if anyone out there prefers The Lord of the Rings to his book, it's also because they're an unsophisticated child who doesn't understand real literature, so take that as you will. However, the authors of The Black Book of Arda and Morlindalë seem much more sincere when they say they are Tolkien fans, and what they're doing isn't meant as a critique or correction of the original, just an alternate perspective. But still, you have to admit that there's something inherently confrontational about what they're doing. They are presenting an alternate version where Tolkien's canon is all lies and propaganda. They are contradicting the very themes that were his very motivation for writing the whole thing. They are antithetical to the Tolkien Legendarium in the same way that the Gnostic Gospel of Judas is antithetical to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But hopefully, most of you aren't religiously devoted to Tolkien. The mere existence of a contrary narrative shouldn't ruin your enjoyment of the original, but it does put certain aspects into sharper focus. If you have a version of The Lord of the Rings that's told in a more modern style with realistic world building and characters, then that really makes you think about the archaic and romantic nature of the original. If you have a version of the Silmarillion that asks you to sympathize with the devil, then that really makes you think about the strong Catholic themes of the original. And I guess for some people, that might ruin your enjoyment of Tolkien. Or it could end up making it even deeper. Or it might have no effect at all. The goal of a revisionist retelling should be to contrast with the original in some substantive way. In a way that makes you rethink fundamental aspects of the story, and whether that ends up being for better or worse or neutral is up for you to reflect on yourself. But yeah, that's all I got. What is your favorite revisionist remake out there from any media property? What's your least favorite? I feel like that'd be very fun to hear about. But yeah, I'll see you the next time, and in the meantime, try not to commit any anti-orc genocides.